Welcome to another Reddit horror story, everyone. Tonight, I have something truly unsettling to share, straight from the depths of Reddit. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, and brace yourself for a journey into fear. This happened to me. We wandered further, letting curiosity guide our steps. The deeper we went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. Trees loomed over us like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches interlocking above, blocking out much of the sunlight. The forest floor was damp and spongy, each step sinking slightly as if the earth itself wanted to swallow us whole. Then we found it. An old, decrepit cabin stood in a small clearing. Its wooden planks were warped and rotting, the roof sagging as though the forest had tried to reclaim it. Vines snaked their way up the walls, and shattered windows revealed a dark interior. There was no mistaking it. This was the heart of the Forbidden Woods. "Whoa!" one of the boys whispered, breaking the tense silence. I didn't think there was actually anything out here. We approached cautiously, our bravado from earlier dwindling with each step. A faint, metallic scent hung in the air, mingling with the damp, earthy smell of the forest. It wasn't blood, at least. I hoped it wasn't, but it made my stomach churn. The door to the cabin hung slightly ajar, creaking softly as the wind nudged it back and forth. I turned to my friends, trying to gauge their reactions. One looked pale, his eyes darting nervously around the clearing, while the other seemed torn between curiosity and fear. "We've come this far," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Let's at least peek inside." The floorboards groaned ominously as we stepped onto the porch. I reached out to push the door open, but before I could, it swung inward on its own, revealing the shadowy interior. My heart raced, each beat echoing in my ears. The cabin was nearly empty, save for a few broken chairs and a rusted iron stove in one corner. Dust motes danced in the dim light filtering through the cracked windows. But something felt off. It was too clean, no cobwebs, no animal droppings, as if someone had been here recently. "Let's get out of here," one of the boys whispered, his voice trembling. But I couldn't move. My eyes were drawn to a single object in the center of the room, a large wooden trunk. Its surface was scarred with deep scratches, and the lock was missing, as if someone had forced it open. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer. "Don't touch it," the other boy warned, but his words barely registered. I knelt before the trunk, my hands trembling as I lifted the lid. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them, all black and white, all of children. Some smiled brightly at the camera, their eyes full of life. Others seemed somber, their faces blurred as though they'd moved at the last second. But what struck me the most was the background of each photo, the forest. "This is weird," I murmured, flipping through the photos. "Why are there so many?" "Guys," one of the boys said, his voice rising in panic. "We need to leave. Now." I turned to see him staring out the window, his face pale. Following his gaze, I saw it too. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, barely visible among the trees. It was tall and gaunt, its outline hazy as if it were shrouded in mist. I couldn't make out any details. No face, no clothing, just a silhouette watching us. "Run!" the other boy shouted, and we bolted out of the cabin, not bothering to close the door behind us. The woods seemed alive now, the trees twisting and groaning as we sprinted back toward the fence. Branches clawed at our clothes and faces, and the ground seemed to shift beneath our feet, tripping us up at every turn. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear something following us, heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching through the underbrush. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop until we reached the fence. We scrambled through the hole, tearing our clothes in the process, and collapsed on the other side, gasping for breath. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, we lay there in silence, the safety of the other side of the fence sinking in. But when I finally gathered the courage to look back, the figure was still there, standing just beyond the barbed wire. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. We didn't talk much on the way back to Grandpa's house. The boys left quickly, muttering excuses about chores they needed to do. I stayed silent during dinner, unable to shake the image of that figure from my mind. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. The events of the day replayed in my head, each detail more vivid than the last. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off into a restless slumber. I woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Grandpa moving around the house, but these steps were slow and deliberate, echoing faintly from outside. My heart pounded as I crept to the window and peered out. The yard was empty, bathed in pale moonlight. But then I saw it, the same figure, standing at the edge of the forest, its gaze fixed on the house. I wanted to scream, to wake Grandpa, but my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I backed away from the window, my entire body trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't come closer, just stood there, a silent sentinel in the night. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and when morning came, I told Grandpa everything. His face darkened, and he sighed deeply. "I told you to stay away from that part of the woods," he said, his voice heavy with a mix of anger and fear. "There are things out there that can't be explained. You're lucky to be alive." I wanted to press him for more information, but he refused to say anything else. The rest of my stay was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched every time I stepped outside. When my parents came to pick me up, I was relieved to leave. But even now, years later, I can't forget that figure or the photos in the trunk. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I know the truth. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. We stumbled upon a clearing large enough to set up our picnic blanket after what felt like hours of trekking through the dense woods. It was perfect, serene, and bathed in soft light, the kind that filters through leaves and seems to whisper promises of peace. The canopy above broke just enough to let the sunlight spill in, dappling the forest floor with golden patches. For a brief moment, the unease that had been gnawing at the edges of our thoughts seemed to dissipate. "We've got the perfect spot," I said, trying to sound cheerful as I dropped my bag. The others nodded in agreement, grateful for the break. We spread out the blanket and unpacked our food. Sandwiches, chips, soda. It was the kind of picnic that screamed casual fun, but we all knew we were pretending we weren't trespassing on land riddled with ghost stories, pretending we hadn't felt the weight of invisible eyes following us. Once we started eating, though, the tension eased. We laughed at inside jokes, played cards, and even dared to make light of the stories that had brought us here. My best friend, Jason, mimicked an over-the-top ghostly wail, earning groans and playful punches from the group. "Maybe the ghost of the girl will join us for snacks," he teased, holding up a bag of chips. "Yeah, and she'll probably ask for her soul back with it," I quipped, earning uneasy chuckles. The laughter felt good, even if it was forced. But as we packed up to leave, the mood shifted. A sudden chill swept over the clearing, raising goosebumps on my arms. It wasn't a breeze, it was as if the cold had materialized out of nowhere, a living thing brushing against us. "Did you feel that?" Jason asked, his voice suddenly devoid of its earlier confidence. We all nodded, exchanging nervous glances. Even the most skeptical among us couldn't deny something was off. Then we noticed the light, or, more accurately, the absence of it. The clearing, which had been bathed in warm sunlight minutes before, was now cloaked in shadow. It wasn't gradual. It was as if someone had flipped a switch. My gaze shot upward, expecting to see thick clouds blotting out the sun, but the sky wasn't overcast. It was filled with stars. "It can't be night already," I muttered, pulling my phone out to check the time. 5:08 p.m. Jason snatched my phone, staring at the screen in disbelief. "That's not possible," he said. "How can it be this dark?" Panic set in. The shadows around us seemed to grow longer, darker, as though alive. Grabbing our things, we started back the way we came. I led the way with my flashlight, its narrow beam barely piercing the oppressive darkness. The woods were no longer the same. The path, which had been clear and inviting earlier, now twisted unnaturally. Branches seemed to reach out like skeletal hands, snagging at our clothes and hair. "Stick together," I called, my voice shaking. "No one falls behind." No one answered. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath our feet and our labored breathing. Every now and then, I thought I heard faint whispers, just beyond the edge of the flashlight's beam. But whenever I stopped to listen, there was nothing. Then came the giggles. At first, I thought I imagined them as soft, high-pitched laughter that sent shivers down my spine. It sounded childlike, but there was something twisted about it, something wrong. Did anyone else hear that? Emily, the quietest of our group, asked, her voice trembling. "I think we all did," Jason whispered. We quickened our pace, the laughter growing fainter but never fully disappearing. By the time we reached the fence, the relief was palpable. We scrambled through the same hole we'd entered, emerging into a world that felt lighter, safer, but the darkness lingered, clinging to us like a second skin. Even as we neared my grandfather's house, where the warm glow of lights and the sound of familiar voices greeted us, the unease didn't fully dissipate. My grandfather and the parents of my friends were outside with flashlights, their voices sharp with a mix of anger and relief. "Do you have any idea how late it is?" Grandpa scolded as he pulled me into a hug. I frowned, holding up my watch. "It's only 5:40, I said, confused. Grandpa's expression darkened. "No," he replied firmly. "It's almost 9 p.m. We all froze. The forest was eerily quiet now, the kind of silence that presses down on your ears and makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. How could that be? We had only been in the woods for about an hour. Or had it been longer? None of it made sense. My watch was still ticking, but the time didn't add up. The sun, which had been high above us when we entered, was now dipping below the treetops, casting long skeletal shadows across the ground. My friends exchanged uneasy glances, and even the bravest of them, Tommy, looked pale. "We should head back," I said, breaking the silence. No one argued. Without another word, we retraced our steps, or at least, we tried to. The problem was, the woods didn't look the same anymore. The familiar landmarks, the old, gnarled oak tree with the broken branch, the moss-covered boulder where we had stopped to rest, were gone. Or maybe we were the ones who had gone too far, past the boundaries we hadn't realized existed. "Are we lost?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Tommy shook his head, though he didn't sound confident. "No, we just need to keep walking. We'll find our way." But the further we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees, tall and ancient, stretched their limbs toward one another like they were conspiring against us. The air grew colder, and a mist began to rise from the ground, curling around our ankles like ghostly fingers. That's when we heard a faint giggle, high-pitched and childlike, coming from somewhere in the distance. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, clutching my arm. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's probably just the wind." But I didn't believe that. Not for a second. Wind didn't sound like a little girl playing hide and seek. We picked up the pace, and for a moment, I thought we were making progress. The trees seemed to thin out, and I caught a glimpse of the old fence line that marked the edge of the woods. Relief flooded me. "There it is," I shouted, pointing. We broke into a run, the sound of our footsteps crunching against the forest floor. But just as we reached the fence, something changed. The air grew heavier, and a low hum began to fill my ears, almost like the forest itself was vibrating. I looked over my shoulder and saw shadows moving, too many shadows, more than there should have been. When we finally climbed over the fence and spilled out onto the open field, it felt like we'd crossed some invisible barrier. The hum stopped, and the world seemed normal again. But when I looked at my watch, my heart sank. Hours had passed. It was nearly sunset. We all stood there, catching our breath, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Sarah was the first to break the silence. "That wasn't normal," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "None of it was." Tommy tried to shrug it off, but even he looked shaken. "Let's just go home." Later that night, after my friends had been taken home, Grandpa sat me down in the living room. The flickering light of the fireplace danced across his face, making his stern expression even more intense. "When I was a boy, that part of the woods wasn't fenced off," he began. His tone was softer now, almost reflective. "My friends and I used to play there all the time, but one summer, a girl from the neighboring town went missing. They found her body days later in a shallow pond deep in those woods." I shivered, leaning closer. The warmth of the fire did little to chase away the chill that had settled in my bones. "After that, strange things started happening," he continued. "People reported seeing her wandering the woods, calling for help. The town decided to fence off the area, but even that didn't stop the rumors. Some say she's still there, trapped between worlds." His words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. "Do you think she's still out there?" I asked hesitantly. Grandpa didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared into the flames, his eyes distant. "All I know is that those woods are not a place for children or anyone, for that matter." I nodded, though his words didn't bring me any comfort. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying everything that had happened. The laughter, the moving shadows, the way time seemed to slip away from us. It all felt wrong, like we had stumbled into a place where we didn't belong. I never returned to those woods. My grandfather passed away a few months later, taking with him a lifetime of stories and wisdom. His warning stayed with me, though, etched into my memory like a scar. As for my friends, we drifted apart. Their parents didn't approve of them spending time with me after that day. They said it was reckless to have ventured into those woods, and maybe they were right. But I still think about that day, about the way the forest seemed alive, as though it had a consciousness of its own. Sometimes, I wonder if the others remember it the way I do, or if the woods let them forget. There are nights when I can't sleep, and I lie awake thinking about the shadows that moved when they shouldn't have, the impossible darkness that swallowed us whole. I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't made it back before the stars came out in full. And I wonder about the girl. Grandpa had said they found her body. But what if that wasn't entirely true? What if some part of her never left those woods? The thought chills me to this day. Once, years after that day, I looked up the old stories about the missing girl. Her name was Lily Harper, and she was just 10 years old when she vanished. The articles said she'd been playing near the woods with her brother when she disappeared. He claimed she'd been following a butterfly, but when he turned around, she was gone. Her body was found 3 days later, face down in a pond that didn't show up on any maps. The coroner ruled it an accidental drowning, but locals whispered about something darker, something the adults didn't dare speak of in front of their children. The pond was drained not long after, and the fence went up soon after that. But fences don't keep out ghosts. Even now, decades later, I can't bring myself to step foot in those woods again. I've heard rumors that the fence has been torn down. The developers want to build a new housing development on the land. Part of me hopes they succeed, that they pave over the dark history of that place. But another part of me wonders if they'll disturb something that's better left alone. There's a part of me that believes the forest will fight back. It's not just trees and dirt, it's something more. Something ancient and restless. On quiet nights, when the wind blows just right, I think I can still hear her laughter. It's faint, carried on the breeze, but it's enough to make me close the windows and lock the doors. And in my dreams, I see her, Lily Harper, standing at the edge of the woods, her white dress stained with mud, her eyes hollow and pleading. She doesn't speak, but I can feel her desperation, her sorrow. Sometimes I wake up with the sound of her voice echoing in my head. Help me. I'll never know what really happened to her or what we stumbled into that day. But one thing is certain, the woods don't forget, and neither do I. Thank you so much for tuning in to tonight's chilling tale. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and share your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, stay safe, stay aware, and don't let the shadows catch you. Because once you feel their eyes on you, you might never be the same again.